Welcome to the Why Didn't I Know podcast, episode 10. I am your host, Dr. Jenny Martin, and today we are also doing YouTube Live. Thank you to the anonymous donor who helped us to actually get all this set up, gave us the support to make this happen. So thank you for supporting this podcast. And you can also support this podcast. There is information in the show notes if you would like to do that. So today's topic actually comes from a question that was sent in. And I'm Dr. Jenny Martin, as I mentioned, psychologist and sex educator, and I talk about the lost teachings of Jesus in the Gospel of Philip and how that relates to sacred sexuality and living a more empowered life. So, as I mentioned, we received a question, and this is the email address. I will link it below as well. It's questions@whydidn'tknow.net, and feel free to send your questions or comments about this episode or any of the other episodes that you can find on Apple, Stitcher, anywhere that you find your podcasts. So you'll be able to watch it or to see it or to listen to it on those places. But we do welcome your questions, and as I mentioned, today's topic came from that. So the topic today is the Great Awakening, God, Sex, God, and Satan. And let me just mention, we will be talking about some pretty heavy subjects today, which is not normally the focus of this podcast. But I promise you, if you stick with me here, this will not end in a depressing note. It actually is a very hopeful, inspiring message, and not just an inspirational message. I'm actually going to be sharing some hard facts with you and some research. So let's get started here, and go ahead and subscribe to this podcast wherever you're finding it so that you don't miss an episode, and so also more people can find out about it. So this topic that we're talking about today does involve some dark subjects, as I mentioned, and it involves the topic of evil. Now, not everybody has grown up to even think that that is real. And in today's society, there is a lot of information out there giving you the sense, oh, no, it's just made up. But there was a book that I think woke up a lot of people. And that book, let me just share this with you here. That book just bear with me here for one moment, is called The People of the Lie. And this was put out by a psychiatrist who's no longer with us. His name, Scott Peck. And he realized that evil does exist. He was working with individuals where you'd have to read the book to get the sense of it, but that the only thing he could come up with was a presence of evil. And that book was a catalyst for, I know people who never even believed evil was real until they read Scott Peck's book, The People of the Lie. You might also know his even more famous book that came before that called The Road Less Traveled, which kind of was the springboard for a lot of the self-help movement and a lot of the self-help industry. But The People of the Lie looked at some cases, individuals that he worked with as a psychiatrist, where he could only come up with the idea that it was evil that was actually running these people. And at that time, you could interpret that however you want, that the evil was somehow just a human phenomena and it wasn't some kind of other unseen force. But as he actually got into looking at this whole concept more and working with more clients, and people found out that he understood this topic and they started coming to him, what he realized is, and let me just share this with you as well. What he realized is it wasn't just somebody dealing with some issue on their own. There was an extra force that was really working with them. And this is where he wrote his last book before he passed away, actually, was called Glimpses of the Devil, a psychiatrist's personal account of possession. So not a lot of people know about this particular book, but this is when he took it from People of the Lie, which you could walk away from that book and think, okay, there's evil, but this is something just humans are dealing with. But if you didn't go to his next book, which was his own evolution of thinking, and that was, okay, this is an unseen force that is actually working on these people. And it's a big topic, and I'm certainly not going to try to go and describe his book right now to you, but that is something just to know that that those books were out there, and they catalyzed a lot of people who were on the fence that evil existed, and even people, interestingly enough, that were on the fence about whether God existed. And it catalyzed them to think, okay, I accept that evil could exist. Well, then maybe God exists, right? And the reason why I called today's topic The Great Awakening 2021 had to do with the question that came to me, and that was on the topic of satanic ritual abuse. And this is a topic that is not new. It's definitely not new today. In fact, many years ago, I was volunteering, helping people who were sexually trafficked get to a safe place and get off the street. In Washington State, I still believe it's this way. They're not prosecuted. They're seen as victims of the crime if they're prostitute, and not criminals, which is it's a wonderful thing in our state. And so I was working with these people and realizing a lot of times there was more to it than being in prostitution. There was much more to it. And at that time, I was looking to understand it a little bit more, and I came across a police report that was declassified. If I had it to share with you now, I would, but I don't have access to it right now. And that's when I realized that this is a lot of psychological manipulation that happens with these individuals. What you would find, for instance, with the women that we helped rescue, who, by the way, were all underage, they didn't necessarily want to stay away from their abuser. They sometimes actually ended up back with them. And this is the part that can be sometimes really hard to understand. But this is where the mind control comes into it. And when I read this police report, I started to see that there is something that even these investigators know is a satanic whole philosophy that wraps around this whole issue. And it's very well developed, the mind control aspect of it. And in fact, there is a conference that happens now for people that work with survivors of this ritual abuse. I personally am not one of those people that work with survivors. I teach sexuality, but in a vein to help people to experience altered state of consciousness in a very positive, spiritual, sacred, sexual way. So I don't work on this side of it, but I have some knowledge of it. But there is a conference that I will show you here if I share my screen again. And if you are listening to this, I apologize, but this is the first time we're live streaming this podcast, so we're just getting some of the kinks worked out. But I just wanted to show you, those of you who are going to watch this on the replay, what this conference is all about. And this is a link that I'm sharing, and I'll link it below as well. And it is called the SMART Conference, and it brings together social workers, psychiatrists, psychologists, people that are actually working with individuals who have broken free from the satanic ritual abuse. And they have numerous papers in recognized journals and so forth, and presentations here, real research here, showing the extent of the psychological control, where it's basically breaking down the person's identity and having them identify with the group. But also there is the sense of real terror. These individuals have been terrorized beyond belief. And this conference really goes into this so that we can understand what this is all about. Just want to make sure we're on schedule here. Okay. So that's something, if you have people in your life that say, oh, this is a conspiracy theory, this isn't true. Well, here's some actual research to show you that it actually is a real thing. And what has been talked about as well is that the levels of sex trafficking, child trafficking, and satanic ritual abuse are at levels that have never reached where they're at now. So basically, there are more people that are enslaved in these cults and by traffickers than have ever been in history. On the positive side, there is a growing awareness, and I have Google alerts set for sex trafficking. And I can tell you, on a positive side, there is every couple of weeks some big bust that happens where, can be hundreds of people are freed, and these things are broken up. But it is out there. It is insidious. It is the places that you least expect. And I can tell you, when I read that police report that I mentioned way back when I first started doing some volunteer work with sexual trafficked victims here in Seattle, that report on the satanic side of all of this topic was really shocking to me in many ways, because I didn't really have any grasp of this topic before that. But one of the things that was most shocking was that the way that people are brought into this as a victim or as a predator is never just, hang a sign and, oh, come on in, let's be involved in some torturous ritual. It's never like that. In fact, it's the opposite. And these people are very well studied in terms of how to bring people into the fold. And it can be a church. The front can be a church. So you think you're belonging to some kind of just normal Christian type of congregation, but it really is a front for these darker things. It can be a social service agency. You think you're going for some kind of social service, but it's really a front for this. And it's not like the person that shows up would immediately know that this is actually something very sinister. They wouldn't know that. It would be possibly months, even a year, before anything is even introduced to them as either becoming a perpetrator of crimes against humanity or a victim of it. It's not going to happen overnight because the average person isn't inclined that way, isn't inclined to hurt or harm another human being. And also, they're not inclined to receive that treatment either, right? So there is an indoctrination process, and what it starts with, I mean, they have a whole profile. The profile includes people that are lonely and disconnected, people that are looking for community, people that are somewhat naive and impressionable. Those things have been talked about. And people that are somewhat idealistic, right? Someone who's a little bit more worldly, a little bit more, not wary, but is a little bit more insightful about what really goes on in the world. They're not, and someone who's more of an independent thinker, they're not as likely to even be targeted by these groups. But someone who's looking to belong, who's looking for a family, a pseudo family, what they find is they'll go to a meeting and they'll be embraced and they'll be really warmly received. They'll be complimented and everything looks like it's on the up and up, right? Everything seems great. All the jargon is jargon that you'd probably hear in a self-help workshop. It all sounds fantastic. And what slowly happens is if we look at, I'll stop sharing this and I will share something else with you here, and that is yes. Okay, so this part of the conference, they were specifically getting into the mind control part of it, and this is sharing, okay, how this is very well researched, by the way, how these groups and cults actually break the person down mentally to be able to have complete control over their mind. And that's why it's so hard to really free someone from this, because there is a level of brainwashing that for most of us, it's really hard to understand. That includes everything from deprivation of food and sleep to just a constant chipping away at their own individual thought process, a constant sense of doubting your own, what your eyes see, and then a sense of taking you apart from any source of stability or removing you from any source of safety in your own mind or life. So, for instance, if you believed in God or Jesus, you would be told that God is punishing you and that's why you're here, or Jesus has abandoned you. So things would be broken down to so that you really believe that the person who's actually going to torture you is actually your savior too, and that you're doing something good by sacrificing yourself. And there's a conflation of meaning in things. For instance, pain is seen as pleasure, and those things are merged. And for instance, some of the different sacraments can involve an abortion that is done without any painkillers, and you're told that it is an honor for that to happen. So by the time something like that happens to an individual, their mind has completely been brainwashed and taken over. So there isn't the impetus to speak up. That has been removed. That sense of standing up for yourself, that sense of having a voice at all has been removed. And at points along the way, there's threats that if you do leave, what can happen. But usually there is a sense of targeting people that don't have a lot of family structure around them as well. So there isn't a lot of safe havens for them. But this is the unfortunate thing that needs to be talked about, because it is happening all of the time. And people are sworn to secrecy. So even if they do get out, it takes a long time for them to open up to actually someone to help them. And also that when they're in the ritual cult situation, oftentimes there will be a pseudo psychiatrist that they will go to see, which will use the same mind control techniques on them, but you'll think you're going to a therapist, you think you're going to a psychiatrist, which what that sets them up for when they do actually finally get out of the cult is that they don't trust a therapist, even if the therapist has, the best interests of the person and wants to free them. They now have had this training, this experience of, well, I can't even trust them. And as I've mentioned, there's this breaking down of any type of spiritual connection that they might have felt before they got involved in this. So there's this sense that Jesus and God are against you or whatever you pray to. And so, and they actually use Christian symbols in their rituals. So when you get out, when you're freed from the satanic cults, when you do see images of Christianity, it can actually have a really adverse effect on you physically in a negative way, because it brings up all of these memories of torture and so forth. And so what is this all about? And this is what we really need to focus on, because we can go down some really dark rabbit holes, and I've purposely not shown you any imagery here because I do not want to participate in distributing that type of really dark imagery, because even if you're just making a research out of it, you're just studying to learn more, to educate yourself, by allowing that imagery to get in your mind, it actually can play on you in a negative way. And I'm not wanting to participate in that. So I'm just sharing these concepts with you that are based on D-class and research. So as I said, mind control, the psychological aspect is really important, because people don't sign up for this stuff. People, as I said, people are not evil. And even when you do participate in something like this, I wouldn't even suggest that the people doing these horrendous things are evil. They are just as much a being of God as you or I. But in that moment, they have chosen to align with really dark forces. And this is the unfortunate thing today. We're told that there is no Satan and that's just fictitious. That doesn't exist. But this is what the satanic cults thrive on. They thrive on that type of ignorance and that type of denial. And you'll see, if you type into YouTube, you'll see a lot of videos coming up with satanic panic, that, really playing on this idea that people have all of this worry about Satanism, but it's really not dark. It's really not anything to worry about. And just the average person has panic around it. And they really try to, that's its own mind control technique. Really it is to take what is a legitimate concern and use it against you. And so that happens all over the internet. And we'll see how widely this video gets to be shared on YouTube. I'll probably end up with more of the content sharing it on Rumble, just because some of the alternative platforms tend to be a little bit more friendly to sharing some of this more controversial information. And really, it shouldn't be controversial. If we're talking about things that are research-based, it shouldn't be controversial, but in our world today, for some reason, it is controversial. So the idea that they're looking to access this demonic realm that exists all around us. And there's angels in that realm too. It depends what you're tapping into, right? But what happens in the dark evil rituals is they're lowering their vibration. And I know this sounds woo-woo, but on another episode of this, I'll explain what we're talking about in scientific terms when we're talking about lowering your vibration, because there's something really to that. And the people that follow this satanic philosophy, they understand this. They understand that there's electromagnetic energy field that is around the earth, and that our bodies are run by electromagnetic energy and biophotons. They might not use all of those scientific terms, but they know that there's force, there's life force energy there that they can feed on and steal, basically, if they torture and kill someone, right? And this is what it's all about. It's to tap into this energy that's all around us, that's invisible. And let me just say this, like, it's hard for us today, I realize, to think there's anything out there other than what my eyes can see. We're so conditioned to believe the material world, the physical world is it. And I will say, not to be a conspiracy theorist, but I will say that we've had a lot of help in that belief that only the physical is real. There has been a disinformation campaign, I believe, so that we don't know that we're multidimensional beings, that there is electromagnetic energy around us. In fact, if you go to, let me just share my screen with one for something else here, and that is, if you go to this website, which is the Freedom of Information Act electronic reading room. What this is information that has been declassified by the Central Intelligence Agency in the United States. And bear in mind that the only thing that you're going to find on there is stuff that's like 50 and 60 years old. But it will blow your mind, some of it, because if they were doing some of this stuff 50 or 60 years ago, you can't even fathom what they're looking into now. And concepts such as mind control and brainwashing are certainly there. You know, this is not made up stuff. And what those things work on, they work on the principle that there's electromagnetic field, we are electromagnetically influenced, we have electromagnetic energy within us, that we are not physical. So in the mainstream, in academia, a lot of times you go to college and you're told, oh, the fact that your body runs on biophotons and not just biochemicals, oh, that's woo-woo. That's woo-woo, right? You have to go to one of those woo-woo schools to learn that. So there's a lot of disinformation around that. In the meantime, secretly, all along, you know, even 60 years ago, if you go to this website, this Freedom of Information Act, you're going to find out it wasn't woo-woo at all. The top scientists, Valerie Hunt, Persinger, top scientists knew that we are far more than we ever imagined, even today. You know, today you turn on the TV and you're told that, you know, you need this drug for this and that drug. And then every drug that you take is going to create 10 more different side effects. So you have to take another drug for that. And there's this constant sense that you're inadequate. And if you don't have, you know, pharmaceuticals, you're going to be a basket case. And that feeds a financial narrative. I recognize it, not to be cynical, but we have to be realistic, right? If we're going to take back our power. This is the great awakening in 2021, is to open our eyes, to see what's going on, and then to take back our power. So, as I mentioned, this website, I think this particular document that I have up here, this particular one, that I'll link below if you like, mentions the topic, get this, Kundalini psychosis. Now, isn't that Kundalini? Isn't that the most woo topic ever? In spiritual traditions in the East, it's very important to people. But why is the CIA looking at Kundalini psychosis? Because these things aren't woo-woo, because these things are real, right? So this is what we need to wake up to, that these things have been going on, and we just have not been told about it. And this is what we need to realize, part of taking back our power. But let me get back to what I was mentioning about why sex is used to what is the part about sex, right? And what we need to know is, when we talk about Kundalini psychosis, there is an energy in the body. And that energy that Kundalini energy, there's a molecule in the body called dimethyltryptamine, DMT, which I've mentioned a little bit on this podcast. I'll go a deeper dive into that in another podcast. It is a psychoactive substance. It's in plants, such as the ayahuasca brew people go to Peru and take to alter their state. Well, DMT is the hallucinogenic part of ayahuasca. And an ayahuasca altered state can last for 6 to 8 hours. If you take straight DMT, which is in our bodies, it's the most intense hallucinogenic experience, and it only lasts for about 15 minutes. Well, we don't walk around in an altered state, right? But we have the precursors of this psychoactive substance in our lungs, in our brain, in our body. And if there is a significant physiological event, so if we're being birthed, during death, and I would also say during certain type of orgasm, the precursor to this DMT, that can ignite the production of it in our brain and body and bring us into this altered state. And if you read some of Rick Strausman's, he wrote the book called The Spirit Molecule, which talks about DMT. He did research at the University of New Mexico back 50 years ago or so. And you will read that people talk about, it's not just like being drunk or being high. You're actually transported into, people feel like it's another realm, and it's even more real than this dimension. And they describe interacting with beings. Some people talk about benevolent, and some people talk about not benevolent. And that has a lot to do with the state of mind you bring into the experience, the context with which you're doing it. A lot of times these plant medicines were used in a sacred way, in a very sacred way, but today people are using these substances in a very haphazard way, and they're having bad experiences. Well, one of the things I intend to talk more about on this podcast is this substance, without taking any drug, lives in our body. And ancient people in matriarchal cultures, they had ritual that involved sex that was not dark and satanic, but was very positive and loving. And they would access an altered state and be able to interact with benevolent beings. So there is something very powerful that sex can give us when practiced in certain ways. Yes, the torture of an individual and the death of an individual it has been shown in the University of Michigan They did studies on dying rats. They induced cardiac arrest. And at the moment of death, the DMT production surged, I believe, 300%. So that gave them this altered state where they saw the white light. They were able to see the visual cortex of the rat lit up. And this is the psychedelic substance being generated in the mammalian brain. And we share the same type of brain. And so it's this near-death experience that people have. It's the DMT that's likely producing those hallucinogenic effects. So if you kill someone in a satanic ritual, the DMT is surging in their body, and then you partake in, this is really disgusting to talk about, but cannibalism, then the idea being that some of that substance is going to be transferred to you, right? Meanwhile, the person who has either been left for dead or actually survives that torturous experience, the victim, they, in my estimation, they're an example of someone that would have Kundalini psychosis. So the DMT, which right now I'm equating Kundalini to DMT in a scientific way. So the raising of this hallucinogenic substance, the DMT, happens to them during the torturous experience, but then they have a psychosis, right? Because if you don't start with the human body being in a place of psychological safety and a sense of love and care, and you raise this DMT in your body, there can be a splitting off. And what I mean by splitting off is multiple personalities happening, psychosis, mental insanity, and schizophrenia. And part of the DMT studies that first focused on DMT in the human body, endogenous DMT, when it's endogenous meaning it's naturally occurring in the human body, the initial studies were actually of people that were in psychiatric units, and they exhibited multiple personality schizophrenia. And it's quite possible, I can't say for sure, but these people could have had a DMT experience through sexual abuse. So they split off in that experience. And now that is all very dark, right? So, but the point here is to realize that God gave us this hallucinogenic substance. And I'm using the word hallucinogenic just for want of a better term. Think of it in terms of mystical, right? Because when people have taken DMT in the lab and they fill out a questionnaire that describes the mystical experience, same type of questionnaire as someone who lives in the mountains and chants and prays all day, the number of similarities between someone who has a deep meditative spiritual practice and accesses a deep mystical state, and people who had taken DMT under conditions of safety and felt, like it was mutually consensual, they had this, a lot of times they had this mystical experience, right? So the fact is, we have this substance within us, and I see enough justification in the ancient history that people knew this. People knew that yes, plants could induce this altered state, but also could consensual, loving sex that was focused on an intention of the divine. So when we have the right environment, when there's a sacred environment, when we have the right mindset, this, and also there's certain things to do, which I we'll talk more about in other episodes. There's certain things to do to be able to evoke this and welcome this presence, but it's all very focused on the Spirit of God. It's all very focused on that. Now, what we need to realize is evil is always take something that God has created for good, always take something that God has created for good and inverses it, right? So the definition of evil being there isn't the ability to create. There is, the creation comes from being in union with God, right? God is creator and we create new life by merging with that aspect ourselves. So the evil cannot create, and what they're doing is excuse me, what they're doing is trying to feed off the energy of somebody who is aligned in spirit. And this is why it's so important for people who are of faith to really understand some of these dark subjects, because ignorance is not bliss. Saying, oh, I don't need to know about that. That has nothing to do with me. Well, it exists in our world and we need to be aware of it and we need to know why it operates. But there's even, I told you at the beginning, I was going to not just make this depressing. Well, here's something that's not depressing and that's really empowering. And that is, if you realize what they're after when they're using someone in a very controlling, demonic, and dominating way for sex, when you realize they're not after just some physical gratification or pleasure, they're not after that. They're not even after just domination of one person over another. What they're after is the access to the invisible life force energy, the invisible power. I've mentioned DMT, but just think about it as power to access the invisible realm. That's what they're after. And here's what really is the hope for me, is that if people look at what's with open eyes, look at what is happening with these satanic rituals, it's a thread back to, if they really understand it in the way I'm trying to explain it here, it should be a light bulb moment to realize, oh, I have that power within me, and I don't need to use death and destruction and evil to access that power. And there's no manipulation and control that would be part of this. But if I realize there is this really potent power to access the divine realm within me, and through pleasure, ecstasy, joy, complete open-heartedness to your partner, just complete love, and of course with a sense of safety and trust and kindness, when those factors are in place, the human body, I am very convinced of this, and I do go into this, I've done some webinars on this before, the science of how this can happen, that this molecule can be tripped off, especially in a woman's body during sex, and then during intercourse, she can actually bring that altered state to her partner. Okay, so I've talked a lot on this particular episode. I've covered a lot of different things. There's a lot more to cover, and I would love to do that. There's a lot more to cover here. So let me just leave it here for today's episode. Thank you so much for joining me. And if you're catching this on the replay, please do share this, like this, and subscribe it so more people can learn about it. And please join me for our next episode. We'll be doing these more often, and you can count on that. So sign up wherever you're listening to this or watching this, and we will catch you next time. Thanks again for joining. See you.